San Quentin State Prison, death row, gangs, and survival behind the walls. The Fortress of San Quentin. San Quentin State Prison is not just a prison. It's a symbol of fear, violence, and death. For over 150 years, its cold concrete walls have housed some of the most notorious criminals in the country. And behind those walls, survival isn't just a game, it's a matter of life and death. The year is 2022. The sun is just starting to dip beneath the hills surrounding California's Marin County, casting long shadows over the sprawling 432-acre grounds of San Quentin State Prison, one of America's oldest and most notorious penitentiaries. The air is thick with tension, the kind you can feel deep in your bones. For the prisoners inside, every day is a battle. The battle to stay alive. The battle to stay sane. The hum of the nearby highway is drowned out by the unmistakable clink of heavy gates slamming shut. Inside, the atmosphere is oppressive, a never-ending struggle of control, chaos, and power. The guards, cold and detached, walk the endless rows of cell blocks, keeping an eye on the men who are locked away for crimes so brutal, so senseless, that their names have become synonymous with violence itself. Yet, even within this fortress of steel and concrete, there are untold stories of survival and defiance, of men doing whatever it takes to maintain control of their lives in a world where nothing is certain. San Quentin is not just a prison, it's a symbol. A symbol of the consequences of crime and a relentless reminder of what can happen when society decides it has no more use for a person. But for those inside, it's more than that, it's their last chance, their final destination. And for some, it's a place where death is not just a punishment but a way of life. "Welcome to San Quentin," the warden had said, the words ringing with finality. For the men who step through those gates, the concept of freedom becomes a distant memory. Inmates arrive here convicted of the most heinous crimes: murder, rape, armed robbery, and gang-related violence. San Quentin is home to a range of criminals, but its most infamous reputation comes from its death row, a notorious wing where California's most dangerous criminals are condemned to spend their final years awaiting execution. But within these walls, there are even darker forces at play. "No one leaves San Quentin the same," says an inmate who's served decades in the system. He never tells his full name, none of them do, but his words are chillingly honest: you come in as a man, but you leave as something else. Inside the prison, there are gangs, fierce, territorial, and deeply rooted in the culture of survival. It's a world of alliances, betrayals, and deadly loyalty. The prison system has been notorious for gang violence, and San Quentin is no exception. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Mexican Mafia all have their presence here, and these factions influence everything, from who gets control of the kitchen to who gets the last spot in the overcrowded cell blocks. Prison is a war zone. But San Quentin is a battleground of its own, where every choice can mean life or death. And the inmates know that the moment they arrive. The story of San Quentin is the story of a place where men are forced to confront their worst instincts, where survival is a ruthless game, and where gang allegiances determine who lives and who dies. It's a story of men, some broken, some dangerous, and some desperately holding on to the last remnants of humanity, all trying to make it through the system that has swallowed them whole. For decades, men have been sentenced to spend their last days here, but there's more to the story of San Quentin than just the death sentences it hands down. The prison itself is a reflection of the society that built it, a system designed to punish, control, and destroy. And yet, beneath the surface of this grim institution, there's something else, a story of power, of survival, and of an undying will to overcome. The battle for power. The gates of San Quentin are not just a barrier, they are a threshold, a dividing line between two worlds. On one side, there is the outside world, a place of order and normalcy. On the other, there is San Quentin, where chaos reigns, and the rules of society are replaced by those of the prison. And inside, everything depends on one thing: power. Power in San Quentin is not given, it is taken. Inside the cell blocks, power is something that flows through the veins of the prison's underground culture. To survive, to make it another day, an inmate must either claim power or bow to those who hold it. The gangs inside San Quentin control everything. Their reach extends beyond the walls, shaping the decisions, the deals, and even the fate of those who step foot in the prison. And the worst part? The gangs don't care about the reason you're locked up. Whether you're there for a petty theft or a horrific murder, once you're inside, you are part of the system. The gangs will make sure of it. One inmate, a former gang member, describes it this way: the moment you enter those gates, you're no longer just an inmate. You're a pawn in someone else's game. And if you don't play by their rules, you'll be crushed. San Quentin's history with gangs goes back decades. Since the 1970s, the prison has been a breeding ground for some of the most powerful gangs in the California Department of Corrections. The most prominent among them? The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla Family. These gangs don't just operate inside San Quentin, they have tentacles reaching deep into the streets of California and beyond. They run operations that stretch from the prison yard to the heart of the state's most dangerous neighborhoods. But the question remains, how does power change hands in a place like San Quentin? What happens when the tension between these gangs reaches its breaking point? It starts with alliances, temporary and fragile pacts forged between inmates who would otherwise be enemies. The gangs don't always have the luxury of fighting each other on the outside. Inside, it's about survival. The enemy of my enemy is my ally, but these alliances rarely last long. When the time is right, one faction will move to destroy the other, shifting the balance of power, sometimes in hours, sometimes in days. The Mexican Mafia, for example, controls much of the prison's drug trade. The Aryan Brotherhood, infamous for its white supremacy, controls a wide swath of the prison's security operations, and the Black Guerrilla Family, born from the revolutionary movements of the 60s, controls much of the prison's intellectual power, its ability to influence the minds of new generations of incarcerated men. These gangs are more than just collections of violent men. They are institutions, with their own codes, rituals, and unwritten laws that must be followed, no matter the cost. The prison system feeds this cycle of violence and power struggles. As new inmates arrive, eager to prove their worth, the gangs look to recruit fresh blood, and in return, they offer protection, at a price. If an inmate refuses to join a gang, or if they attempt to leave one, they risk becoming a target, often ending up at the wrong end of a shank or worse. You can't survive in here without the gangs. That's the truth, a former inmate recalls. You join, or you become a mark. No one's going to let you slide. You've got to pick a side, there's no middle ground. But even with all the bloodshed and violence, there's one thing that the gangs can't control: the system itself. The California prison system, with its overcrowding, lack of resources, and chaotic infrastructure, is a perfect breeding ground for corruption. And inside San Quentin, the prison guards are often caught in the crossfire. There's a long history of guards being involved in the smuggling of contraband, drugs, weapons, and cell phones, into the prison. Some of them are bought off by the gangs, while others are simply overwhelmed by the chaos. The guards can only do so much to keep order, and in a place like San Quentin, order is a fragile illusion. In the death row units, the inmates who are sentenced to die are not just facing their own mortality. They are also facing the reality of being at the top of the food chain, the last bastion of power. These men are often the most dangerous, the most calculating. For some, death row is a way to achieve a type of immortality, a legacy that lives on in the stories told by other inmates and the media. One man, Robert Alton Harris, who was executed in 1992, became one of the most notorious names on San Quentin's death row. His execution was broadcast live to the world, making him a symbol of everything that was wrong with the justice system, but also everything that was right with the system of prison power. He became a legend in the eyes of the men on the inside, an example of defiance, of survival. The thing about power in San Quentin is that it doesn't come without a price. To climb the ranks, to reach the top, you have to shed your humanity. It's a place where morals and ethics go out the window. Loyalty and survival become the only things that matter. And once you make it, once you have the power, you become a part of the very machine that keeps this system running. It's not just about surviving the gang violence, the overcrowding, and the constant threat of death. It's about surviving the system itself. And in San Quentin, the system is designed to break you. But for those who can adapt, who can learn how to navigate this twisted web of alliances, betrayals, and violence, power is something that can be grasped, even in the darkest corners of the prison. This is the brutal truth of San Quentin. Power is always changing hands, always in motion. And for those who find themselves trapped within these walls, there's only one rule to follow: adapt or die. The Death Row Chronicles. San Quentin's death row is not just another part of the prison, it's a world unto itself. Hidden behind steel bars and armed guards, it is a place where time stands still, a place where men sit in limbo, waiting for a fate that has already been sealed. It is a place that defines the true meaning of isolation. For the men condemned to live there, each day feels like a year. Inmates sentenced to death row do not just face their own mortality. They live in a perpetual state of fear and tension, where every moment could be their last, and every noise that echoes through the halls might signal the end. One of the most notorious parts of death row at San Quentin is the solitary confinement cells. It's a place where, for 23 hours a day, prisoners sit alone, staring at the blank walls of their cells. There's no movement, no interaction with other inmates, just the crushing weight of loneliness and the knowledge that, unless the system changes, you will die here. It's in these cells that the true psychological toll of being on death row is felt most acutely. Inmates often report the crushing silence that envelopes them, the absence of sound being as terrifying as the thought of execution itself. It's the silence of finality, the silence of a life slowly ticking away, minute by minute. But even here, in the grim silence of death row, there is a hierarchy, a system of survival and power. Even the men who are doomed to die know that there is power in the prison. And the gangs are no exception. Death row inmates are some of the most powerful men in the system, if only because they've been removed from the general population and placed in a position where they can control the very structure of the prison, even in their isolation. For a while, San Quentin had a reputation for being a sanctuary for the condemned, a place where death was delayed by a single bureaucratic hiccup or legal loophole. Many death row inmates sat for decades in their cells, waiting for their appeals to be heard, waiting for the courts to delay their executions, waiting for a final moment of reckoning. But this waiting game is not just a battle for life or death. It is also a psychological battle that takes its toll on the men confined there. The constant uncertainty, the perpetual state of fear and suspense, erodes the mind, leaving many of the inmates in a state of despair. One of the most infamous death row inmates was Cary Stayner, a man whose crimes shook California to its core. Cary was convicted of brutally murdering 4 women, and it was during his time in San Quentin that he became infamous, not just for the horrific crimes he committed, but for the chilling coldness with which he spoke of them. Cary's case has been widely discussed, with people still debating whether he deserved the death penalty or whether he was simply the product of a twisted, dysfunctional family. Stayner's case is just one of many that has stained San Quentin's history. While some prisoners on death row choose to spend their days in quiet reflection or prayer, others like Stayner, whose crimes seemed too horrific for redemption, still flaunt their violent pasts. His case is still cited in debates over the efficacy and morality of the death penalty. For most men, though, the end on death row is not a cause for celebration. In fact, the uncertainty of when death will come is sometimes more cruel than the finality of execution itself. The waiting game can stretch for decades, and the closer a man gets to the end, the more his mind fractures under the pressure. The constant anxiety, the ever-present knowledge that your life is about to be taken, creates a mental cage that no one can escape from. And yet, despite this, many of the men on San Quentin's death row have found ways to adapt. They create their own routines, their own strategies for survival. It's a system built on psychological manipulation, a constant push and pull between loneliness and power. For those who've spent long years there, it's the only way they know how to survive. The days on death row bleed into each other. There is no sunrise or sunset to mark the passing of time, just the cold fluorescent lights that flicker above, indifferent to the lives they illuminate. The men behind these walls are often forgotten by the world outside, their names and stories slipping into the shadows. Yet, inside those walls, they continue to exist. Struggling, surviving, and holding on to whatever scraps of dignity they can. Most of them are locked away in solitary confinement, each man isolated in his small, barren cell, with nothing more than a bed, a toilet, and a steel door separating him from the world. There is no companionship, no comfort from family or friends, only the endless hum of the prison's daily routine. The silence is suffocating, and for those without mental fortitude, it becomes unbearable. But within the darkness of isolation, there are always men who find ways to fight back, not just against their fate but against the prison itself. They turn to mind games, manipulating the system and the people around them to gain whatever semblance of control they can. This battle for control is not just physical, though that plays a huge role, especially when it comes to gang allegiances and violence. It's also psychological. Death row becomes a place where the mind is both the weapon and the battlefield. The inmates learn quickly that their fate, while sealed in the eyes of the law, is still subject to the whims of power structures within the prison. Some inmates attempt to forge alliances with others, to form bonds across the walls of their cells, seeking to stay connected to a world they can no longer physically touch. These alliances are often precarious, built on trust that can easily shatter under the strain of the harsh prison conditions. The gangs that hold sway in the general population also extend their influence here. Even in the solitude of death row, power is never far behind. Members of the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, and other groups may not share the same cell, but their influence reaches deep into the darkest corners of the prison, dictating who survives and who doesn't. One infamous case is that of Charles Manson, the notorious cult leader who, while never executed, spent his final years on death row at San Quentin. His mere presence on the unit made the atmosphere even more charged with violence and terror. Manson, known for his manipulation of his followers to commit murder, remained a figure of both fear and fascination for many of the men incarcerated with him. His hold over the minds of those around him was legendary, and though he did not meet his end on the execution table, the memory of his influence remains a chilling reminder of how the lines between manipulation, control, and violence can blur. Yet, despite the grueling nature of their confinement, many death row inmates find themselves becoming part of the system they hate. They are no longer just prisoners, they are symbols of rebellion, defiance, or corruption. They are seen as legends by some, feared by others, and, in the case of certain notorious individuals, even worshipped in their own twisted ways. But these men are not just waiting for death, they are waiting for answers. And sometimes, in a place like San Quentin, those answers come not from the system but from the very men they are locked away with. They trade information, stories, and sometimes even hope. It's a delicate dance of survival. It's a power game, says a former inmate who spent years on death row. Every decision, every move you make, whether it's keeping quiet or talking, agreeing or refusing to join a gang, it's all about asserting power. You've got to show them who's boss. Because if you don't, you'll never get a chance to. In here, that's all there is. The impact of this constant psychological warfare is undeniable. Many men who enter San Quentin with some semblance of hope or humanity find that it slowly fades away with each passing year. The mental toll is so intense that it begins to wear them down, eroding their sense of self. It becomes easier to give up than to fight, easier to accept the inevitable than to push back. But even in the face of such despair, some men refuse to break. For them, death row is not just a sentence of finality, it is a battle of wills. The desire to maintain control over one's fate is the last thing they have left, and for some, that means maintaining their sanity at all costs. For others, the power of their mind is what gives them the strength to continue. Inside the walls of San Quentin, the death penalty is no longer just a legal concept, it is a reality that shapes every part of life on death row. It looms over the inmates, a constant reminder that every day could be their last. But even though the system may have condemned them to die, the prisoners themselves are the ones who decide how they will live in their final days. The courtrooms may have rendered their verdicts, but within the walls of San Quentin, it's the inmates themselves who write their own stories. And for those who are condemned to the bleakness of death row, their stories are often written in blood, fear, and defiance. As the years pass on San Quentin's death row, the men there begin to feel the weight of time in ways few can comprehend. Their bodies age. Their minds bend under the constant pressure. Some become shadows of the men they were before the execution orders were handed down, while others harden into figures of defiance, determined to preserve their humanity in a place that strips away everything, except the will to survive. Death row at San Quentin is a paradox. It is a place of ultimate punishment, yet, for many of the men locked inside, it is a place where they feel an odd sense of control. Here, on the edge of their existence, they are still the ones who decide who they will be. And they will choose, for as long as possible, how they face their end. Take, for instance, the case of Stanley Tookie Williams, a man who would become a symbol of redemption. Williams was convicted for 4 murders and sentenced to death in 1981. He was the co-founder of the Crips, a violent gang that dominated much of Los Angeles. In prison, however, Williams underwent a remarkable transformation. After years of silence, he began to speak out against the violence and drugs he had once glorified. Over the course of his years on death row, he wrote children's books, started anti-gang programs, and was even nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But despite his change, his death sentence was never commuted, and in 2005, he was executed. His story, however, illustrates an essential truth of death row: redemption is not often granted by the system, no matter how much an inmate might change. San Quentin's death row is not a place where one can easily earn a second chance. It's a place where the cost of change is paid with blood, and redemption is often just an illusion. Williams' story, however, also stands as a testament to something else. Even in the darkest corners of San Quentin, where men are sent to die, there are still those who try to fight for something more, a legacy, a purpose, a reason to stay human until the very end. Yet, for every man like Williams who found redemption in the face of death, there are others who are swallowed whole by the system. For them, San Quentin becomes nothing but a waiting room for the end. The psychological weight of it all becomes unbearable, and many simply lose themselves in the process. One particularly tragic example is Clarence Ray Allen, who was convicted of ordering a murder from his wheelchair while incarcerated. Allen was sentenced to death in 1982, and for 23 years, he remained on death row at San Quentin. In 2006, at the age of 76, he was executed, the oldest person to ever be executed in California. He had spent decades in prison, but it wasn't just the years of confinement that wore him down. It was the constant psychological torment of knowing his fate was sealed. The last years of his life were marked by failed appeals, death threats from other inmates, and his own realization that he would never leave those walls alive. The sheer grind of waiting for death, of having your future decided by forces beyond your control, is perhaps one of the cruelest punishments that can be handed out. For many men, death row is not just a physical sentence, it is a psychological torment that devours their spirit. Inmates on death row are frequently subjected to mental health evaluations, as the system begins to realize just how damaging long-term solitary confinement can be. However, these evaluations are often inadequate. Most of the men on death row have already spent decades in isolation, and the psychological toll is clear. Many suffer from severe depression, paranoia, and schizophrenia. Some can no longer tell the difference between reality and their own delusions. Their personalities erode under the weight of isolation and impending death. And in the midst of all of this, there is the physical side of death row, a place where even the smallest of infractions can lead to a swift and violent punishment. Inmates live under the constant threat of violence from other prisoners, especially if they refuse to adhere to the unspoken rules of the gangs. A misstep, a wrong word, a slight, these things can cost someone their life. The guards, too, can be unpredictable. sometimes meting out harsh punishments for seemingly trivial offenses. It is a world governed by fear, where trust is fleeting, and betrayal is common. But even in this hellish existence, there are moments of solidarity, brief flashes of camaraderie between men who know they have nothing to lose. Some share stories of their lives before prison, of the families they left behind, of the worlds they once lived in. Others form alliances, if only to survive the daily grind. There are men who form tight bonds, sharing meals, trading letters, and offering support to each other in a place where everyone else has abandoned them. It's a fleeting connection, often built out of desperation, but for the men on death row, it can be the difference between holding on to their last shred of humanity or succumbing completely to the prison system's dehumanizing effects. One inmate, who spent years on death row before eventually being released, reflected on his time there: in death row, you don't get to live. You get to survive. There's a big difference. Survival means doing whatever it takes to get by, whether that means making deals with fellow prisoners or turning a blind eye to the violence around you. You learn to live with the constant hum of death, always just around the corner. For some, this means holding on to small victories. They read books, write letters, engage in any small act of rebellion against the system that tries to break them. They make their own meaning out of the chaos, creating routines, finding ways to make life in the confines of death row feel less like a waiting room and more like a place where they can still fight. But no matter how hard they fight, the ultimate question remains: will it be enough to change their fate? The death penalty in California, like in many other states, is a subject of intense debate. But in San Quentin, the reality for those on death row is clear. The system is designed to break them, mentally, emotionally, physically. And it does. The final countdown. The clock on death row doesn't just mark the time, it marks the inevitability. For the men locked away in San Quentin, the hands of the clock are a constant reminder that their time is running out. The days stretch into years, but it's the final days that are the most suffocating, the most unbearable. These are the days when the death penalty becomes real, when the threat of execution is no longer a distant fear but a tangible, imminent fate. For most of the men on death row, the final countdown begins with the receipt of the execution warrant. It's a formality, a piece of paper that changes everything. Suddenly, the world outside doesn't matter anymore. The only thing that matters is that single piece of paper, the legal declaration of a date that will mark the end of a life. In the final days before execution, the prison shifts into a different mode. Guards take on an added responsibility, watching the condemned men more closely. For many inmates, it's a time of isolation, their last chance to reflect on their lives, their crimes, and their choices. The final 48 hours are the most harrowing, filled with an ever-present tension that even the guards feel. For the men about to die, there is no escape, no chance to appeal, no more chances for leniency. This is the time when everything about their lives comes into focus. Some men experience a sudden clarity, as if everything they have done and everything they have endured suddenly makes sense. It's as if they can see their entire life in the space of a few hours, as if the looming execution brings everything into stark contrast. But for others, the final days are marked by denial, by a refusal to accept the reality of their fate. They may revisit their crimes, attempting to find meaning or justification in the acts that led them to this place. Some try to reach out to family, hoping for a final moment of connection, a last word of forgiveness or reconciliation. Others turn inward, retreating into the isolation that has been their constant companion for years. In some ways, the countdown to death mirrors the isolation that has been the hallmark of their time on death row. You think you can prepare for it, but you can't. You think you can control your fate, but the moment that piece of paper arrives, you know. You know it's real. A former inmate who was on death row recalls the night before his scheduled execution. He was moved to a different cell, isolated from the general population. His meals were stripped of any seasoning, as a way to cleanse him before the final step. He says that for the first time in years, the weight of his crime, the one that had defined his entire existence, was truly real. The most grueling part of this time is often the waiting. Men who know their death is coming are forced to sit in their cells and wait for hours, days, or weeks. The uncertainty about the precise moment of their death gnaws at their psyche. Time stretches in ways that are impossible to describe. Every sound, every footstep, feels amplified, as if the end could come at any moment. Even the sound of the guard's boots echoing in the hallway brings a shiver of fear, the final footsteps that will bring death closer. One of the most infamous moments in death row's history is that of Gary Gilmore, who was executed by firing squad in 1977. His case became a flashpoint for the death penalty debate, but it was also the last moment of control he had over his life. Gilmore, a man who had spent his years on death row reflecting on his crime, demanded that his execution be carried out quickly and with dignity. His final words, "Let's do it," are etched in the history of capital punishment. For him, it was not about seeking redemption or regret, it was about facing the inevitable with as much control as possible. But not all men on death row approach their fate with the same resolve. Some fight till the end, desperate for any shred of hope, hoping that a judge or a lawyer will deliver a last-minute reprieve. Others fall into deep despair, unable to escape the psychological toll of knowing that their execution is inevitable. The process itself becomes its own punishment. The uncertainty, the helplessness, the finality, it eats away at their will to survive. As the execution date approaches, some prisoners experience a nervous energy, their minds racing over their past actions. Reflection becomes an inescapable part of their final days. They think back to the choices that led them here, the lives they took, the families they destroyed. Others are haunted by their victims' faces, unable to escape the guilt and shame that has followed them for years. In the final 24 hours, the routine shifts. Inmates are given their last meal, a tradition that has become one of the most widely known aspects of the death penalty. The request for a last meal can be as simple as a hamburger or as complex as a multi-course feast. Some men request specific foods as a way to cling to a sense of normalcy in the face of death. In one notorious case, an inmate requested a single olive with the pit still inside, a small, surreal moment of defiance against a world that had already sentenced him. But the ritual of the last meal is just a prelude. For the guards, the warden, and the prison staff, it marks the final moment before the execution itself. The procedure for an execution at San Quentin is cold and methodical, conducted in the execution chamber, where every step is dictated by rules that are as sterile as the environment. For the condemned man, there is no going back. He is led to the chamber, where he will be strapped to a gurney, injected with the lethal chemicals, and watched by the eyes of the state. The prison cameras capture the final moments for historical documentation, and the outside world watches with varying degrees of sympathy, anger, or indifference. Some inmates face the end with peace, having made their peace with God, their families, and themselves. Others go kicking and screaming, still fighting, even in their final moments. The executioner does their duty, a job they perform with detachment, knowing that their role is not to judge, but to carry out the sentence handed down by society. And when the deed is done, when the man's life is taken, the prison returns to its routine. The death is logged, the paperwork filed, and life goes on for everyone else, but not for the men who remain on death row. They know that their time will come too. For those still awaiting their fates, the final countdown continues, always ticking, always nearing. The next execution will be their own. As the cycle of death continues in the oppressive confines of San Quentin's death row, one of the most enduring elements of this place is the sense of futility that permeates everything. The guards, the wardens, and even the death row inmates themselves know this simple truth: once you're here, your time is no longer just yours. It is now owned by the state. The final countdown isn't just a matter of minutes or hours, it's a mind game, and the stakes are always life and death. The final days of a death row inmate are shaped by this all-consuming inevitability. For many, the realization sets in that they will never leave these walls alive. They may have spent years, even decades, fighting the system, but the legal appeals, the clemency hearings, and the constant hope of a reprieve are dashed by the cold reality of the state's decision. Every minute, every hour, Every day that passes brings them closer to the inevitable. Some inmates react to this finality by closing themselves off completely, retreating into silence and solitude. Others become more vocal, more desperate, trying to make a final plea to the world outside, reaching out to the media, to their families, to anyone who might listen. A few attempt to escape in whatever way they can, either by taking their own life or trying to make a last-minute break for freedom. But even in these desperate attempts, the power of the system is overwhelming. No matter how hard they fight, no matter how much they scream for mercy, death row is a place where the system ultimately gets what it wants. Among the men condemned to die, some face their end with remarkable resilience. They have lived their entire lives in a world of violence, trauma, and brokenness, and execution becomes just another chapter in their grim story. For them, there's a strange sense of closure in the end, a dark form of peace. Inmates like David Lee Powell, who spent 14 years on death row, claimed he found solace in the finality of his fate. Powell had been convicted of the 1978 murder of a police officer, and for years he fought against his death sentence. But after nearly 15 years in solitary confinement, Powell's attitude shifted. He stopped fighting, stopped appealing, and began to accept what was coming. "I've lived in hell for all these years," he said in his final interview, "the only peace I've had is knowing it's almost over." Powell's resignation was chilling but not uncommon. Many men who have spent decades on death row end up in a similar state of mental exhaustion. The legal wrangling, the court delays, and the continuous appeals process sap their will to fight. For some, it becomes easier to simply let go, to stop hoping, to stop fighting for the small chance of survival that had once kept them alive. When death is your only future, survival becomes less important than simply accepting the inevitable. But not all men succumb to that bleak finality. For some, the final days become an opportunity to find redemption, to reach out to others, to show some sign of remorse, or to attempt to make amends for the lives they took. Stanley Tookie Williams, the co-founder of the Crips gang, is a case in point. Convicted for the murder of 4 people, Williams spent his years on death row writing children's books, establishing anti-gang programs, and becoming a voice for peace. His transformation from hardened gang leader to an advocate for reform was profound, and though he would ultimately be executed in 2005, his story continues to be one of the most poignant in death row's long history. Williams had spent 23 years behind bars, but his final acts showed the world that even in the darkest places, change is possible. He pleaded for clemency, arguing that his life had been a testament to his transformation. However, his request was denied, and he was executed, his story becoming a reflection of the complexities of justice and redemption. In contrast, there are inmates who spend their final days embracing their crimes. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized California in the 1980s. Convicted for the murder of 13 people, Ramirez spent decades on death row, where he became a symbol of depravity. Ramirez never showed remorse for his actions. Instead, he spent his time preaching Satanism and reveling in the media attention that his crimes had garnered. In his final years, Ramirez became a cult figure for those who admired his defiance against authority and his unapologetic nature. Even after being sentenced to death, Ramirez remained a fixture in the public consciousness. His case became a national conversation about the nature of evil, and his final moments were a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist in the human soul. The contrast between Williams and Ramirez is a stark one: 2 men, condemned to die, but whose final days were worlds apart. One sought redemption, the other sought notoriety. It raises a fundamental question: what makes a man change? In the confined spaces of death row, some men discover that the only way to survive is by finding a sense of purpose in their last days. They engage in deep introspection, attempting to make sense of their lives and their choices. Others, like Ramirez, remain entrenched in their psychological battles, consumed by their past actions until the very end. As the execution date nears, men on death row are given the opportunity to write their final statements. These statements, sometimes lengthy, sometimes short, are their last words to the world. They are sometimes a plea for mercy, sometimes a confession, and sometimes just a final, bitter declaration of innocence or defiance. Some men choose to speak to their families, while others aim their words at the public, hoping that their last moment will be remembered in some way. But perhaps the most haunting element of the last moments of a death row inmate's life is not the final statement, it is the silence that comes after. When the execution is carried out, there is a finality to it that settles into the prison. Guards leave the chamber, the paperwork is signed, and the world moves on. For the other men still waiting in their cells, the ticking clock continues. Some will live another day, others will not. But for all of them, the countdown continues. In the brutal world of San Quentin's death row, time is the only constant. The final reflection. As the days pass, as the ticks of the clock reverberate through the cold, sterile halls of San Quentin, the story of the men who live and die behind its walls remains one of uncertainty, torment, and survival. The psychological toll that death row exacts on its inhabitants is not just a matter of time, it's a war fought inside the mind. For those condemned to this lonely, suffocating fate, it is a battle they can never truly win. These men, their stories, their struggles, each of them is a reflection of something much greater than the walls they live within. It is the struggle between humanity and despair, between hope and resignation. It is the constant push and pull between survival and the familiarity of death. San Quentin, with its ancient walls and layers of history, stands as a symbol of what happens when we as a society decide to cast someone aside, to label them, convict them, and then remove them from the world. But even within the deepest corners of this prison, within the confines of its death chamber, there are men who still fight, who still refuse to let their souls be consumed by the system that holds them. They may be locked away, but they are not forgotten. Their stories don't end when the final breath is taken. No, they echo across time, across the years, shaping the conversations we have about justice, about punishment, and about the value of a life. What do we do with a person once we've labeled them irreparably broken? How do we reconcile the horrific crimes they've committed with the undeniable truth that, in some way, they too were once human? These questions, left unanswered, continue to plague society's conscience. We look at the inmates, the convicts, the condemned, and we see them as something less than us. We dehumanize them because it makes it easier to bear the weight of their crimes. But the truth is, they are still human. Their stories, for better or worse, are intricately woven into the fabric of our own society. These men, who once walked among us, who once had families, who once had futures, they did not always begin as the monsters we see before us today. But the system we've created, the justice system that seeks not only to punish but to erase, has shaped them into something unrecognizable. We've created monsters in our own image, and now we ask the hardest question of all, was it inevitable? As we close the chapter on San Quentin's death row, we don't just leave behind the stories of these men. We carry them with us. We carry the question of what it means to be a person, to be a prisoner, in a system that thrives on isolation and dehumanization. We carry the unanswered stories of those whose final moments were not captured in the courtroom but rather in the silence of their cells, in the coldness of the execution chamber. In the end, we must ask ourselves, what is justice? Is it the death penalty? Is it the long, drawn-out process of waiting for death to arrive? Or is it something more, something that transcends the walls of prisons and reaches into the hearts of those who are willing to confront the real cost of human lives, of human mistakes, and of the choices we make when we take another person's freedom away? These questions may never be answered fully. But the stories of San Quentin, and the lives of those who spent their final years in its dark corridors, will continue to speak long after the gates are shut. Their legacies remain as a stark reminder of the harshness of life inside the prison system, the struggles of the human spirit, and the deep and complex issue of what it means to be condemned. The death penalty, often debated, is still practiced, leaving the final question unanswered: how do we, as a society, continue to reconcile punishment with humanity? As we reflect on the long journey through the corridors of San Quentin, we come to realize that each man's story is unique, each of their paths to death row different, each decision to become who they were a reflection of the choices they made, and the environment they were shaped by. But ultimately, they are no different from the rest of us. We all have the capacity for good and evil. And it's through understanding these men, through learning from their stories, that we can better understand the complexities of justice, morality, and human nature. For the men on death row at San Quentin, the prison may have been their final destination. But their stories live on, etched in time, ingrained in the discussions we have about life, death, and the justice system. Their fates were sealed by a legal system that did not allow for redemption, for second chances, or for growth. But in the end, it is the humanity of the story that remains the most powerful. These are not just stories of violence and crime. These are stories of lives lost, of men who had no choice but to endure, and of a system that ultimately has failed to find a true way to handle redemption and punishment. The story of San Quentin State Prison does not end with the sound of a cell door slamming shut or the final step toward the execution chamber. No, the repercussions of a place like this, a system like this, are felt far beyond its walls. For every man condemned, for every gang member or criminal who steps foot inside, there is a ripple effect, a lasting impact that touches not only the inmates but also their families, the communities they come from, and the society that has created this never-ending cycle. Behind every prison gate, there are families. The stories of their loved ones may be forgotten by the world, but for those left outside, the pain and loss never truly go away. The families of death row inmates are left to deal with a unique grief, one that is compounded by the stigma of a loved one being convicted of something so heinous, yet also by the uncertainty of knowing that the end is always looming. For many families, the pain is not just the loss of a loved one to prison, but the emotional and psychological toll of watching someone you love die, over and over again, in slow motion. When Harris D.'s brother was sentenced to death in 1995, the grief was immediate. "You feel it the moment you hear it," Harris said, recalling the day he found out. "It was like they ripped a piece of my heart out. Not only did they take my brother away, but they told me he was going to die in there." Harris's brother was one of the many men who sat on San Quentin's death row, awaiting the moment when his life would come to an end. For the families of men like Harris's brother, the emotional toll of waiting is unbearable. The stress of not knowing when the execution will occur, waiting for a phone call, for a notice that the state has decided that the time has come to end the life of a family member, is enough to tear families apart. For years, many families live in a state of limbo, never knowing when they'll be forced to say their final goodbyes. But it isn't just the family members who suffer. The communities that are affected by the men who are incarcerated inside San Quentin are often forgotten in the conversation about crime and punishment. These communities are already struggling with issues of poverty, violence, and systemic inequality. When a man is locked away for life or sentenced to death, the ripple effect spreads, damaging entire neighborhoods. Often, these communities are already in crisis, and the impact of losing a father, a brother, a son, is immeasurable. The emotional toll is compounded by the financial burden that families endure. Prison visits, lawyer fees, court costs, all of these weigh heavily on families who are already struggling to make ends meet. When someone is sentenced to death, the cost of maintaining a relationship with that person, of staying connected, becomes an insurmountable challenge. Many families find themselves caught in a system that not only demands financial sacrifice but also requires emotional labor, the effort to continue to love someone who is out of reach. For those on the outside, the grief and pain never truly end. But for the men inside, the physical and emotional cost of death row is much more than just the threat of death. It is a psychological and spiritual toll that shapes everything about their existence. The cost of death by execution is not just the loss of life, it is the loss of humanity itself. In the harsh environment of San Quentin, the inmates spend their days reflecting on their past crimes, haunted by guilt and the knowledge that they will never be able to atone for what they've done. The prison is a place where time is frozen, where men's lives are reduced to mere waiting rooms for a fate already decided. The toll on their mental health is staggering. Loneliness, despair, guilt, these emotions compound over the years, until it becomes almost impossible to distinguish between who they were and who they've become. John W. spent 15 years on death row before his execution in 2002. He was convicted of a double homicide, a crime that haunted him every single day he was locked away. He wrote letters to his family, to his lawyers, and to anyone who would listen, expressing his remorse. Yet, despite his pleas for mercy and redemption, the state carried out his execution. His story is one of many. Stories of men who spend their last days trying to reconcile with their past, knowing full well that their chance at redemption will never come. For the guards and staff of San Quentin, the cost is also profound. The emotional weight of working in a facility like this is immense. They are tasked with overseeing the lives of men who have committed heinous crimes, yet they are also expected to maintain order and security. Some guards have been known to form connections with the men on death row, connections that are born out of sheer empathy. But there's a fine line between empathy and detachment. Too much empathy, and the job becomes unbearable. Too much detachment, and the humanity of both the prisoner and the guard is lost. And then there's the system itself, the prison industrial complex that profits off of incarceration. The cost of maintaining death row in California alone is astronomical. According to reports, the cost of housing a single death row inmate is far higher than that of a general population inmate. Death row inmates require special cells, extensive security measures, and additional resources for their health and safety. The state spends millions of dollars every year maintaining the death penalty, only to have it rarely enacted. California's legal system has dragged on for years, constantly being challenged, and ultimately creating a scenario where the cost of execution outweighs its benefits. The debate over whether the death penalty is worth the financial and moral toll continues to rage. It's a question that has no easy answer. Some believe that the ultimate punishment should come at any cost. Others argue that the entire system is flawed, and that the death penalty is more about retribution than justice. The cycle of redemption and despair. At the heart of this debate lies a moral dilemma that has yet to be fully addressed. What happens to a person when they are stripped of their humanity and placed in a system designed not for rehabilitation, but for punishment? The men on death row are not just the sum of their crimes, they are men who have been broken by the system, caught in a web of unforgiving consequences. For some, the final days in San Quentin become a fight for redemption. They may not be able to undo their past, but they can attempt to make amends in their final hours. Others, like Richard Ramirez, never find redemption, only defiance. Their final moments are filled with bitter declarations, as they refuse to admit their guilt or show remorse. The system has failed them, and they, in turn, have failed the system. But for the families, the loved ones who visit the inmates through the glass, who wait for the phone call or the letter, there is a different kind of cost. It is a cost that cannot be measured by money, or even by the time spent behind bars. It is a cost of love, of grief, and of an endless sense of loss. The families of men on death row must live in a state of constant mourning. But unlike other forms of grief, it is grief that is prolonged and complicated. They are not allowed to mourn in the traditional sense. Their loved ones are not dead, but they are not alive, either. They are somewhere in between, a place where death lingers over them like a shadow, forever reminding them that the clock is ticking. In the end, the true cost of death row is not just the cost of life, but the cost of the soul. The toll it takes on the prisoners, the guards, the families, and the society that watches, all of them are changed in ways that cannot be undone. Reflections from behind the walls. As we close the final chapter on San Quentin's death row, we are left with more questions than answers. What happens to a man when he is locked away for years, perhaps decades, in a solitary cage, awaiting a fate that has already been sealed? What happens to those who wait, not just for death, but for redemption or a second chance that never arrives? And most importantly, what do we learn about justice, punishment, and humanity when we look behind the cold, steel walls of a place like San Quentin? The story of death row at San Quentin is a story of extremes, a place where the very best and worst of humanity meet head-on. It is a reflection of a system that has the power to shape lives, but also to destroy them. For the men who live there, there is no escape. Whether they are awaiting their final breath or slowly fading away in isolation, the system becomes their only reality. But there is also another side, a side of humanity that refuses to die, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. These men, stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and sometimes their very will to live, still manage to cling to something, whether it's regret, hope, or a strange form of defiance. For the families of those on death row, the toll is different. Their loved ones are not truly dead, but they are lost, trapped in a system that offers no chance for redemption or reconciliation. The endless waiting, the phone calls, the letters, the visits through thick glass, it's a cycle of pain, a cycle that repeats itself until there's nothing left but the constant, brutal reminder of the loss. And then, one day, it ends with the call, he's gone. But even then, the pain doesn't go away. The psychological toll remains, and the question of whether justice was truly served will linger long after the execution. The lives of these men, and the families who loved them, become a part of a larger narrative, one that raises important questions about the cost of the death penalty, and whether it truly brings closure or simply deepens the wounds. As we reflect on the lives lost behind the walls of San Quentin, we are forced to confront the complexities of the prison system and the justice system. These systems, designed to protect society, have often proven to be flawed, riddled with corruption, inefficiency, and a disregard for the humanity of the men and women they incarcerate. The death row inmates at San Quentin are not merely cases or statistics, they are real men with stories, regrets, and sometimes, redemption. Their fate may have been sealed by the law, but the scars left on the system, on their families, and on society at large are far from healed. For the men who spent their final years in that dark place, San Quentin was a metaphor for the larger issue at play. It was a system that condemned them to death, but also a system that tried to break their souls. For some, the fight for survival was more important than the fight for life. For others, the battle was against the darkness inside, trying to find peace in a world that had never shown them mercy. And for a few, their fight was against the system itself, trying to survive the slow, suffocating process that was never about justice, but about control. Now, as the gates close behind San Quentin, and the final echoes of its haunting history fade, we are left with one undeniable truth: the legacy of death row will never truly be erased. The faces of the men who lived and died there, the families who waited, the guards who witnessed it all, they will carry these stories forever. And the system will continue, perhaps evolving, but never forgetting the lessons learned from those who spent their final days behind bars. This documentary, though it tells the story of just a few men, is a reminder to all of us that the cost of justice is not just about the final verdict. It is about the human lives caught in the crossfire. The men on death row may have paid the ultimate price, but so did everyone who was touched by their lives. And so, we end this journey, not with a final judgment, but with an open question that remains unanswered: what is justice? And how far are we willing to go to seek it? Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more in-depth explorations of America's criminal justice system. As we draw the final curtain on the story of San Quentin State Prison, it's important to remember that the tale we've just told is not a simple one. It is a complex web of human lives, choices, and consequences, tied together in ways that are often hard to untangle. The story of death row, the lives of the men who spent their final days there, and the ripple effects felt by their families and the greater community is a narrative that continues to evolve. These are not just isolated stories of violence, punishment, or redemption, they are the echoes of a larger truth that remains unresolved. The prison itself, with its towering walls, its history of violence, and its deeply ingrained power structures, is a reflection of a system that often seems to have lost its way. The justice system is designed to be a mechanism for societal order, a place where criminals are held accountable for their actions. But what happens when that system is more concerned with punishment than rehabilitation? What happens when a person is locked away, out of sight and mind, without any meaningful chance to change or grow? The men on death row at San Quentin did not just face the end of their lives, they faced a system that had given up on them long before their final breath was taken. The question, then, becomes not just about their fate, but about the fate of the system itself. For every man on death row, there are countless others who will never even make it that far. There are millions of people behind bars in this country, and for many, death row may seem like an extreme anomaly. But the reality is that the same broken systems that condemn these men to death are at play throughout the entire prison industrial complex. The failures, the flaws, the psychological toll, and the emotional cost are things that stretch far beyond the walls of San Quentin. For the families of the men on death row, the pain and loss don't simply end with the execution. They continue to live with the aftermath, the long years of fighting for justice, the waiting for the inevitable, and the deep, haunting grief that follows. These are families who live in a state of perpetual mourning, never truly able to move on, never able to close that chapter. For many, the pain doesn't go away once the sentence is carried out. The question of what could have been always lingers, just out of reach. In the larger context, it's easy to forget the impact that the prison system has on the communities from which these men come. Overcrowded, underfunded, and plagued by systemic issues of race and class, prisons like San Quentin are part of a much broader cycle of poverty, violence, and disenfranchisement. In these communities, the loss of a father, a brother, or a son is not just a personal tragedy. It is a loss felt by everyone. These communities are already struggling, and the impact of losing a loved one to the prison system is not just emotional, it's financial, it's social, and it's cultural. The streets where these men came from remain fraught with violence, instability, and despair. Death row may seem like an isolated issue, a distant and final punishment for those who have crossed a line too far.